But while we're waiting to curate some of your questions, I want to start over here. And Willie, what's one thing that stood out for you in Jason and Adrian's responses? Let's start there.
Well, I took great notes. I just mentioned the this wonderful comment, compost for the next generation. Would hold on to that for a while. That's a great line. Um, you know, what's clear to me is that and both my wonderful colleagues here, they put it on the table very nicely for us. There's a kind of conversion that's necessary for us. And for those of us who are Christian, maybe the way we ought to put it to ourselves is that um, has the conversion actually gone all the way down to the dirt for us? And I am not sure we are yet. I mean, it's almost like we're at the doctor's office and we have not yet fully reckoned with what the doctor just told us. That you have a problem and you need to address it. And so I think what's clear to me is the question that's ahead of us is how do we actually articulate salvation now that has anything to do with the dirt? And I think for so many people, there's a level of resistance here because in some ways we have to overcome centuries of bad preaching and a certain form of our own spiritual life that does not actually need land. I always say that most churches don't have a real ecclesiology. What we think is ecclesiology is what happens inside the church building. And so the question is, can we rethink it? And these wonderful comments, I think, press that even more powerfully. What would it mean now? Okay, now what does that mean in terms of how I preach? What does that mean in terms of the kind of spiritual life? What does it mean for the prayer life that I'm recommending and inviting people to practice, if in fact it touches the ground? I mean, this is a great challenge that's happening, as many of you know, around the world with formerly colonized Christians who are trying to reclaim their indigenous lives, their connection to the earth, and trying to figure out what kind of Christianity actually makes sense if we take the ground seriously. Because for so many people, the practices of their people were presented to them as pagan, as demonic, or at the very least, intellectually deficient. And so how do you change that for people who, for generations, have been taught that if you have a connection to the land, there's something wrong with you, and there's something wrong with your faith?
Adrian, what's stood out for you? Listen to Jason again tonight, because you and Jason have had a dialogue. And by the way, if this website is just being relaunched around this conversation, and Jason and Adrian have a wonderful conversation that we've uploaded onto that website that you get a chance to listen to as well. But with your conversations with Jason, what's emerged for you, Adrian?
What I've always appreciated about Jason is the lived reality that he speaks from and being a part of something and not just theorizing about it, but doing really excellent looking at scripture again and taking another perspective on it. Because I do that all the time as an Indigenous person, and that opens up the doors of kind of conversation with other people. But Jason does it with me. He does the same thing. He'll go through a text, and I'll say, "Oh, I didn't see that." So that I take notes as well from what he does, and I appreciate every conversation I get to have with him. So.
It's wonderful. Jason, we want to go to your questions. Do we have any questions ready? Elaine. While you're getting the question ready, I want to ask you, Jason, what gives you hope like in the midst of this? I know the land trust has been one sign of hope, but what are the other signs of hope for you toward this move towards the commons and away from the property paradigm?
So I didn't know that Willie was going to be talking about the commons today. So I think that that meant that we were inhabiting a spiritual commons already before coming into this event. And it's helpful for me because my experience of that Milky Way garden, of seeing that land pointing to a relation beyond property as a commons, for me was always, it always had a spiritual vitality that I've been trying to sort of give language to. And you talked today about the sacrality of the commons and named the way that sharing that happens within that is it's sort of a confirmation and then an expansion of my understanding of the spiritual potential of the commons. You are bringing it more into a specifically Christian idiom. This land is not, it's not church land. This is a land that is used by many people, and yet there was a spiritual vitality there that I would rarely see inside of churches. And so I'm grateful that Willie's helping to continue to expand that understanding for me of what I call spiritual commons. And Adrian continues to teach me, as he has been for hundreds of years, come back to this dish with one spoon.
Great. Question.
Okay, we have a couple that kind of link together. So this is about, what is the role of church to create and cultivate healthy public spaces? And a second part to that is there a risk of the public nature being undermined by churches who are trying to enact their own agenda in those spaces? And kind of linked to that concept is, considering friendship centers as being potentially a healthy public space. And what is the role of friendship centers, perhaps? So that could be for any.
Well, let's start with church spaces. How do church spaces become spaces of commons? What are some important steps towards that in your minds, in your thinking?
That's a great question. I want for churches to start to worry about what does it mean to create a space for everyone. I mean, this in many ways is the way we take hospitality outside of just a very narrow vision of saying hello to strangers that come into the door. And how do you enact a reality of shared space? Now, the logistics is one question, but I think for me, the deeper level, the deeper question is the kind of theological vision that informs what you want to think about as a community. And for me, what's involved is thinking through the very nature of Christian witness. We give witness to the abundance of God. And I think for so many churches, the challenge is how do you enact that in a reality in which you have to give up control? Because that's the bear in the room. To have a space that is a space of abundance means it's a space that you really can't control. You can't decide who comes in and goes out, how long they stay, what they'll do, and you're vulnerable. And so when I go to many churches and talk about this, every question really is about how do we protect ourselves against the stranger. And what's the answer to that question? You can't. So there's that reality of Jesus in the crowd that is so much a part of what it means to think about creating hospitality in spaces, friendship spaces, spaces that are open. And what's the reality of Jesus in the crowd? The crowd almost destroyed his life. The disciples had to do everything they could to keep his body safe from the crowd. And as I like to say, at one point in time, it must have happened at some point in time in his life in the ministry. he realized that he couldn't keep his body safe from the crowd. In fact, he would have to give his body to the crowd. And that's exactly what he did. Now, thankfully, we don't have to give our body to the crowd like Jesus, because he's already done that. But we do have to be present with the crowd. I think that's kind of where we have to start. We have to start with talking about the need for control, the fear of the stranger, the fear of the other, and the demand that Jesus places on our lives collectively to be open.
Let me try and rephrase maybe that question. I don't even know if this is what you were intending to ask, but for Adrian, in Vancouver, where I live, we have an Aboriginal Friendship Center. That's the actual name of the place, not far from where I live. And it's a different kind of space from the way many church buildings function. And I'm wondering whether you could speak to that, Adrian, of in indigenous spaces can we learn about how to operate our churches or have them release them in ways to the community? What could we learn from that?
Yeah, I think the idea of control, as Willie has mentioned, is high in churches. Yeah. We're going to control whatever. And my question always to people is, where do you hear the voice of non-Christians? Yeah. And you should be able to hear it in your setting, whatever the setting is. Somebody even advised every church committee should have somebody who doesn't follow Jesus on it. Because then there's a voice that will speak to whatever. And to me, the Indigenous community does that in the sense of they don't want, controlling, directing voices. They don't want Christian proselytization. That's not what's desired. But for you to tell your story is good. And so I think that's something good to think about. Where do you hear the voice of somebody who doesn't follow Jesus?
That's great. Very, very concrete. Another question, Eileen. Jason, you want to respond to that? Or any of those?
I mean, I'm a little wary. There's a member of my board and the director of property relations, or property resources in the room. But I will say that over the years, it has been my desire to transform the church building where I serve into a commons.
Yeah.
And I won't say that by no means do I have a model, but we have opened our doors and we have about 7 local community organizations that populate and animate that space 5-6 days a week.
Yep.
And so I think that is that's my attempt to not so much control, but to open the space and to try not to here's again where there may be pushback from board members, try not to monetize the per square foot rate that people pay when they come in, but what's the kind of exchange that we can come up with? You need space, we have space, we got to pay the bills. What kind of a partnership can we build with these sort of mutual desire for the good of the neighborhood and the needs that need to be met?
So good.
So there's a couple questions around like the framework for what we're talking about. Does the Bible give a normative framework for relationship with land and property? If so, how do you come to terms with things that look like theft and ownership and colonialization? For example, the conquest of Canaan, inheritance. And then specifically to Dr. Jennings, have you considered frameworks of belonging from other cultures? And in a few short sentences, please elaborate as to why.
Great questions. Let me start with that first one. Let me recommend a book to everybody by Mari, M-A-R-I, Jorstad. Her book, The Hebrew Bible and Environmental Ethics. This was a dissertation done at Duke University a few years ago under Ellen Davis, and it's been published, Cambridge Press, I believe. But it's the best book that I have ever read that helps us understand what, for lack of a better word, the animist sensibility that's in the Hebrew Bible. And so let me explain that very quickly because I saw some eyebrows go like that. Let me explain this very quickly. So what Mari does in that wonderful book is that she points out that one of the problems in the way biblical scholarship and the way many Christians read the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that we read property relations back into it. We read private property back into it. So we read the conquest narratives as though they're fighting over property, like Russia and Ukraine. And so what do we miss? We miss the most important thing. The land is alive. It's animate and communicative. It is person. So when you read the Bible, if you don't approach it that way, you will treat the land in the Bible as though it's just inert property. And so much of it you will miss. So, for example, I was raised in the church, and I heard 1,000 sermons from the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Literally 1,000, maybe more. And there is something in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, that is almost at the end of every story that I've never heard preached in my entire life. It's when you read so many of the stories in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the story will end with something like this. And that is why this land is called this today. And that is why this marker is here today. I've never heard anybody preach that. Now, what any Bible scholar will tell you, that's the point of the story. That's the point of the story. So now the question is, why hasn't it made its way into Christian preaching? Because we don't see the land as a crucial part of the story, as a living part of the story. So to come back to this wonderful question, we have to think about what it means for God to say, you will take this land. Think of it as Jorstad says, think of this more like a marriage. You're going to now go and be with this land. And if you do bad on this land, the land will tell on you. And in fact, the land will tell God what you've done. And if it's too bad, the land will spew you out. It will throw you out. The land is alive and watching you. And not just the land, follow me, friends, the animals too. As Peter Berger said so many years ago in his wonderful little book about looking at animals, for most of the world, for most of time, people live with what most of us don't live with anymore. That is, we live with the fact that we live looking at animals. We don't live with the fact that animals look at us, that we are being observed by animals, that we are being judged by animals. And could it be one day that God will call the animals forth to judge, to be a part of judging us? Now, for some of us, that's nonsensical. But the problem is that if you read the Bible, the animals actually have a voice. Now, what was the second part of that question? I got so excited with the first part, but it's the belonging, right? It was belonging
From other cultures specifically.
Well, I think what's important for us to recognize is that belonging is less a concept, a Christian concept, and it's more a shared constellation of practices. And what do I mean by that? So Christian belonging is a reality of practice that should be woven with other forms of belonging. So it's not like we have to define what a Christian practice of belonging is apart from other forms of belonging. It's a practice that invites other practices. It's a practice that is open to its expansion and growth inside of other practices. Because if I want to belong to you, I depend on you to tell me what it means for me to belong to you. And that's exactly the way it should be.
I'm going to go wild on this question. This Sunday, I'm preaching at a Appleby United Church, and the title of my message is Peter H. Bacon Cheeseburgers. And it's the story of Peter going to Cornelius' house. You know, the lead up to this is that he's in a city, Joppa. He's on a roof. He's hungry. And he has a vision, a sheet let down from heaven, and all kinds of animals on it, including a pig. And he hears a voice that says, Peter, slay and eat. You're hungry? Slay and eat. 3 times. And Peter says, no, I don't eat, anything unclean. And while he's thinking about that, then there comes somebody knocking on the door saying, an angel appeared to Cornelius and said, send for Peter. He's down at Joppa, and he'll come and, tell you something important. So he realizes now he's going to leave. First of all, Peter's at Simon the tanner's house. In the Jewish world, when you tan leather, you're dealing with dead animals, unclean animals. So Peter's already on the edges of acceptable Jewish society. He's there in a place where, the people there are unclean. And if he's staying there, he's eating and touching unclean people. So according to the culture, he's going to be unclean. And then he hears this story, and now he's going to go to Cornelius, who's an Italian, Gentile, clear Gentile. And he goes there, and this Gentile tells the story of how an angel appeared to him and told him, etc. And then Peter gets the revelation. Even Gentiles, if they fear God and do what's right, they're accepted by God. And then he begins to preach about Jesus to them. And while Peter is preaching, not even at the end of his sermon, before his sermon can even be done, the Holy Spirit falls on them, and those Italian Gentiles start speaking in other tongues. And then the company sit back and they say, shall we withhold water if God has already given them the Holy Spirit? And then Cornelius says, stay with us. And Peter stayed there for several days, which meant he was going to not only visit somebody's house, he's going to be living with Gentiles for several days, which means when you live with somebody, you're going to eat what they eat. And they were eating non-kosher food, the Gentiles, including bacon, and including the idea of putting cheese onto your cheeseburger, mixing dairy and meat. Clearly non-kosher. And you know how it is some of you know nothing about this, but some of you do. When you cook bacon, especially in a big family, you cook the whole 2 pounds or whatever. And the whole house gets full of the smell of bacon. And it just gets all over everything. When Peter came back to Jerusalem, he passed by the priests, and they smelled the bacon on Peter and says, oh, you've been eating with Gentiles. And you know what that story is telling me? Not this interesting, little Peter ate bacon cheeseburgers. The idea was, it should have been that the Christian Jewish followers of Jesus, who were tightly, restricted by their kosher diet laws, could have seen in this story of God's miraculous work that yes, you could be among the Gentiles and not be unclean. You could have fellowship with the Gentiles. You could have received their hospitality. You can eat their food. And God has even said their food is clean. It ought to have led to an outpouring and connection between the Jewish followers of Jesus and all of these Gentiles who are willing to encounter Jesus in the same way. But it stopped right there. And for decades, the community withdrew from that hospitality. What an opportunity was missed because of fear and the lack of enjoying the land and the hospitality of the land and the people. So that's my answer.
Well, let me pose one to Jason that's, I feel, still under this framework question. Unlearning the property principle requires more than appeals to conscience and altruism. Do you have a vision of a broad revolutionary social movement? If so, what form does it take?
I mean, I think it's the proliferation of commoning. I think that's the trick. And I don't have a vision for a social revolution except for the gradual commoning of all of our spaces. And I often think that the place to start to unburden ourselves from property, and this will depend a bit on the organization of each church, but certainly within the Anglican world, the way that we inhabit our churches is already a few steps removed from a private property relation, because there's a board, there's these layers that distance us from that grasping, and we are already accustomed to sharing in a way. And collective ownership is something that we already know, and so I've been thinking for a while that there might be a way of translating the reality of the governance of certain board-run congregations as maybe a way that we can begin to relate to other aspects of our property. The problem, of course, is that we import often the home ownership model into the church belonging model, and that's not helpful. I think it needs to go the other way to distance ourselves from that sense of grasping.
So I'm grouping a number, building on this concept of commons. There's a few questions around that. So we are in a room surrounded by physical reminders of white institutional power, but what are some built form symbols that represent space as commons? What do you think, and so this can be for any of the speakers, what do you think may be corrupted in our image of God that leads us towards the ownership property paradigm? And how might our image of God need to be changed to help us move towards the commons?
Question. I'll tell you why. Because in so many places they are always under assault. So a community pool, for example, they have disappeared in the States in rapid succession. A commons at heart is a place where thriving is available for everyone in that space. So, and some commons are quite frankly illegal. That is to say, a group of kids have turned this into a skateboarding area. And folks sit here and they actually eat lunch and they do other things. And so wherever, either episodically or structurally, people are able to make something a place of consistent thriving and freedom is where you can see a common. So in some communities, like where I used to live in North Carolina, and the good old YMCA, the YWCA, and the parking lot by the YMCA, right there. Some churches' parking lots where they never have enough cars to fill it, but the community makes use of it. And so there are some commons that happen on purpose and some happen by accident. But we need an intentionality. And we need to cultivate it. And what's so great about a commons is when it starts to work, it starts to become a place of shared memory. People remember hanging out here. They remember the good experiences or some of the challenging experiences. And of course, the problem is that in so many communities, if a commons starts to form, or there is a commons, you always have to worry about new zoning policy that is purposely trying to get rid of it. And here's where we just have to think more clearly about the problem and opportunity of zoning policy.
Just any brief answer on theological, what's gone wrong in our thinking about God that's led us in this private property paradigm?
That's your turn.
Oh, okay, that's my turn. Yeah, I've talked about this. I think at heart, and I talk about this in the Christian imagination, the fundamental mistake was to tell people that they could understand who they are apart from the land, and to place it inside Christianity. And that's at two levels, friends. It's not only people being told that they may no longer identify who they are with the land. That is to say, they have to carry their identity wholly on their bodies. That's the first level of problem. That's the first level of problem, that, who you are, your first name, last name, that's it. There's no place necessary for me to know who you are. You carry that on your body. That's the first level of problem. The second level of problem is that you come to believe that you can know yourself apart from any place. So that the land is taken away from you as an important reality of self-knowledge. You gotta let that sit with you, because 90% of the Christians I meet don't understand what I just said. This is why most of the Christians I know do not have a doctrine of creation. In your minds, you can live anywhere in the world and it makes no difference. As long as you have a Starbucks, a couple other nice places to go, all of it is the same. Because there's no place that tells you, helps you come to know who you are because you are there. And these two realities of problems are embedded in our Christianity, and they are both anti-Christian. That's what I can't get most Christians to understand, because they don't believe what I just said. So God really doesn't care about this place. God just cares about you in the place. Follow? God just cares about you. This is just a stage. The earth is a staging ground for your relationship with God. And that's how many Christians think about it. And as long as we think that way, no matter what we say about property or land, we really don't believe it. Because this is just a stage. And you know what you can do with a stage?
I want to ask a question about the property paradigm. We're recognizing that the property paradigm is not working for the next generation. So, my kids are, most of them are not going to be homeowners because they can't afford to buy a home and own a home. And so the property paradigm is not working for the next generation. And what opportunity, and Patrick Condon, a UBC geographer, has written a book called The Broken City, highlighting how the divide coming in the world is coming between homeowners and non-homeowners. And this is what lies ahead of us in an unequal world. What can the church do, and particularly, what can we do with our land that can start to offer resistance to that reality of inequality that's emerging in the property paradigm.
And the one thing I can think of is to help to make property ownership less desirable. I think we sort of need to move away from that narrative that we're all going to be property owners. I think that the surface of the earth just doesn't allow that to be a possibility. But if we can make non-ownership life desirable, like that's another dimension of the commons, right? Making all spaces desirable to live in. So perhaps there's a way for the church to, as we think about developing housing, developing affordable rental housing might be one way of doing that, but desirable affordable rental housing.
Yeah, I think, can I just add quickly to that? I think that you're exactly right. The other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to think about life without cars. Cars are a profound driver of poverty in this world, my friends. And cars, our built environments, in many cases, are built primarily for our cars, not for us. Houses are built with cars in mind before people. And if we had to think about living without cars, the built environment would change drastically. But you are exactly right. Home ownership, in many ways, I mentioned this to, where's she at? We were sitting at dinner together. Maybe she left. Um, Here's what we have to remember, that right now in real estate, one of the transitions that's happening is that people are less interested in buying and selling houses and more interested in gathering the debt. The debt is more important than the house because the debt is the thing that can be sold again and again. And so increasingly, it's not even going to be between people who have houses and those who don't. It's people who actually own their homes and people who simply live with a lifetime mortgage or a lifetime rent. And that's the challenge we're facing. And so you're exactly right, Tim. This is not sustainable. No. And so we will have to think about cars. We'll also have to think about, I mentioned this earlier, we have to think about zoning policy. It's a fight. It's going to have, I mean, I don't mean fight in terms of weapons and so forth, but it's a struggle against the way zoning functions and rethinking dwelling and all that's involved with that.
Oh, good, because I really want to squeeze this in because it's several people together. Hello? I'm back. So there's several questions. There's a certain feeling of overwhelm and just like there's a lot here from where people are starting from to what you've talked about tonight. And so in the interest of time, trying to, with great respect to all the wisdom, collective wisdom on the stage, maybe in one or two sentences, where's the first step? Like, what are those initial steps towards, the theology of land rooted in treaty, stewardship, and sharing, and all that you've talked about?
I'll start. So, what I always say to churches is the very first thing is learn your place. Just start with learn the place. It's simple. I always say this: three things. One, what's the history of the place that you're in? There's so many people they don't even know the history. Let's just do that. If you learn the history, you will. What normally happens is you immediately know what next steps you need to take. Learn the history. The second thing is learn the place. What's going on around this church? Who's here? What are the struggles? What are the challenges? Learn the place in a 5-mile radius around the church. Just learn the place. And then the third thing, which in many ways you can make the first thing, go to the altar, get on your knees together, and say, God, what would you like us to do and be in this place? and make that not a one-time event, but a regular part of your life together. God, in this place, we in this place, what should we do and how should we be in this place? If you start there, that's enough.
I think I would say it's a version of the same thing. Get to know, like one way that it's possible that Diocese of Toronto has a really good archive, and so I was able to trace the root of title for the parish where I work. So it's really interesting to trace that back, understand the history of the ownership, and what has taken place over the course of a century plus. In my case, I think that's really important knowledge, especially if we're going to be thinking about land-based reparation. So, but that's a knowledge piece. But the other is get to know your place. In terms of my own journey into this land stuff, was using theological reflection to make sense of something I experienced in the neighborhood. And so that's not going to work that way for everybody, but that's certainly how it worked for me. So it's not starting with the big theological concepts we're talking about, but it's starting with getting to know your neighbors, getting to know the good stuff that is happening in your neighborhood, and then take the time to reflect theologically on that and see how the church might participate in the good things that are happening.
1 minute. West Bacon coming in here again.
I'd say walk the land regularly, on all the time. And then after reading Maury Jorstad's book that was referenced here, ask yourself the question, what is the land saying to me?